Hi. Next histology topic is connective tissues. There are, remember, 4 categories of tissues, and we did epithelial tissues. Now we're going to do connective. The next 2 are muscular and nervous. Connective tissues, in my experience, is the one that's probably the most difficult for students. And I think that the reasons are kind of these reasons. It is really, really a diverse tissue, meaning it does not look, each connective tissue doesn't look like the other connective tissue. For instance, blood is a connective tissue, and fat is a connective tissue, and bone is a connective tissue. But you can see with the 3 of those how you go from fluid to squishy to solid. So they don't seem like they would have a lot in common. I'll explain to you in a minute why we put them all in the same category of tissues. It's a really, really widespread tissue. It's really variable. It's really common. It's all over the body, with the exception of the fact that on a good day, you should not have any connective tissue on the outside of the body. For instance, if your bone is poking out or you got fat poking out, you're having a bad day, okay? Usually most connective tissues are highly vascular, meaning that if you took a cross-section through a connective tissue, you could get a blood vessel or a capillary in there. That's different than epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissues are generally not very vascular, most of them, except for the endocrine organs are highly vascular, the endocrine glands. And generally speaking, whereas epithelial tissue has, I'll just show you a random connective tissue for a second to get you thinking about this. Epithelial tissue has the cells right next to one another. When you're talking about connective tissue has a cell. Here's one, here's another cell, here's another cell, here's another one. And notice that there's a lot of space between the cells. So there's a lot of room for what we would call extracellular matrix. So generally speaking, connective tissues are going to have a lot of room between the cells. So widely scattered cells with lots of space between each cell. And that means, of course, that you're going to have to get to know the things, not only the cells themselves, but also the things that are between the cells. Okay, so there are major categories of connective tissues that seem like they would be really different and wouldn't go into the same big category of tissues. And that's what we're showing here. There are 3 major categories of connective tissues right here. There are what we call the connective tissues proper. Those are kind of the squishy connective tissues. I will explain it in far more detail in a little bit. And then there are what we call the supporting connective tissues. Those tend to be relatively more solid. Think blood and bone. And then there is one fluid connective tissue that you are going to learn. Oh, sorry, I said blood and bone. I meant cartilage and bone. Cartilage and bone are the supporting connective tissues. Those are more solid, help you resist gravity. And then there is the one fluid connective tissue that you're going to learn, and that is blood. Blood is actually a connective tissue. Now, what do all of these have in common? What they all have in common is that they originate from this common embryonic connective tissue called mesenchyme. And we'll get into that in a little bit later. This is what mesenchyme really kind of looks like. I would never ask you the mesenchyme slide because it's really difficult to tell that it's much of anything. There are definitely cells that are separated from one another, but I have difficulty figuring out what's between the cells. There's also another kind of embryonic connective tissue that can give rise to all of the adult connective tissues. And this tissue is called mucous connective tissue. So these are the 2 tissues that give rise to all of these tissues. So really, what adult connective tissues have in common, more than what they look like, is where they came from. So any tissue that you can trace back to that common embryonic connective tissue called mesenchyme or mucous connective tissue is going to be a connective tissue in an adult. Okay, so that's the intro to connective tissues. Now, I'm just going to take a few minutes and talk about the basic organization of connective tissues. So what do connective tissues really have? What they have is they have cells, but then they also have stuff in the tissue that is not cells. So let's just look at a characteristic. This is like a cartoon of a connective tissue. But please note that there are cells, because you can tell they're cells because they've got nuclei, right? And then there is stuff that is not cells. The stuff that is not cells is going to be collectively called extracellular matrix. Extra meaning outside the cells, and the matrix. Okay, we'll talk about extracellular matrix in just a little bit, but let's talk about the cells for just a second. Generally speaking, when you run into the cells in a connective tissue, they're going to fit into one of three categories. And here's an important thing about connective tissues. You actually have to name the cells. Whereas when you were looking at epithelial tissues, you had to call it simple squamous epithelium, but you didn't have to name an individual cell. Whereas in connective tissues, you're going to have to know what the cells are called. And I'll give you some guidance on doing that. So generally speaking, what you're going to do is you're going to run into several different kinds of cells. Some cells are going to have the prefix blast, and you see one right here. That's a fibroblast cell. The prefix blast you should have learned, the suffix blast you should have learned when you learned your list of prefixes, suffixes, roots, and combining forms. Blast means bud or to divide. So you might run into an osteoblast. That would be the precursor to bone. In some tissues, you'll run into a fibroblast, like you see here, and a fibroblast will generally make fibers. That's its job. Okay, once you run into a cell type that is more mature, you can call it a site cell. Here's an adipocyte right there. When it is a site cell, it is generally relatively mature. It's not developing or making anything at the same rate as a blast cell. So you see an adipocyte here. You also will run into osteocytes in bone, and you'll run into chondrocytes in cartilage. And then, although not pictured in here, there is also in some tissues what we call a clast cell. And clast is to destroy or to break down. So when we get a little further into bone in the next chapter, you'll run into an osteoclast cell. And what an osteoclast cell does is breaks down the bone so that you can remodel it. So you are going to, in each connective tissue that we go through, you're going to be naming the cells, and I'll guide you through that. There are also sometimes other kinds of cells that migrate or wander in. So for instance, you see right here this macrophage cell. That macrophage cell is a type of white blood cell that wandered in. They often do wander into connective tissues. And it's not as if you're going to have to be able to recognize every single type of cell in a connective tissue, but in each connective tissue, you're going to have to be able to name one type of cell. Okay, so now let's talk about the matrix, or the extracellular matrix that you're seeing right here. So what is extracellular matrix? It is really anything that is in there that is not cells. So it's extracellular, and the extracellular matrix is composed of fibers. So let me show you some of the fibers here. I'll kind of draw with them. Okay, so we've got several types of fibers. So you see this long skinny fiber right here that I'm drawing next to. This one's even thinner right here that I'm drawing next to and branched. There are going to be three categories of fibers, and then I'll go back and pick up what's going on with the ground substance. And depending on how many of each of these fibers and what orientation they have, it's going to give the tissue some characteristics. So these fibers are made of proteins. They would have been made by some kind of cell and then secreted by the cell. The collagen fibers that you're seeing right here tend to be straight and thicker than most fibers. Collagen is strong. I want you to think of it like the fibers that you use to make a rope. It is the most abundant protein in the body, It is the one that is really responsible for holding up your skin and all of your other stuff to resist gravity's pull. And it's generally going to be unbranched. And in your notes, you can see that it makes up 25 to 46% of all the proteins in the body. It's a really, really abundant protein. Now, if in this picture, like here, you see just one collagen fiber, that's not going to be as strong as when you bundle collagen fibers like this. So if you get a whole bunch of collagen fibers bundled running one direction, then they are going to be super duper strong in that direction. You can also use rope fibers, however, to make a net. So if you run bundles of rope fibers in different directions or collagen fibers, you're going to be strong in a bunch of different directions. Okay, so what about elastic fibers? Elastic fibers tend to, they're right here, you can see them. They tend to be darker and sometimes they do branch. You can also see one, I'm going to draw it alongside it. Here's an elastic fiber right here. That's an elastic fiber. They tend to stain. Usually dark blue or dark purple. Sometimes they even almost look black. They're made of the protein elastin, and the metaphor that I'd like for you guys to use for those is kind of like the elastics that you would use for braces. Individually, they're going to be relatively thin, but collectively, if you got a whole bunch going together, you could make it really, really strong, but it would still be stretchy. So they're springy and flexible. They're not as strong as collagen. They do stretch, and collagen doesn't really stretch. If you bundle them up, they will get pretty strong though. And then last but not least, usually really difficult to see, is these little fibers right here that are called reticular fibers. Reticular fibers, the metaphor I like to use for those is really like the fibers that you would use to make a hairnet. Reticular fibers are really thin, they are super branched, and they may appear net-like. And they're made up of collagen, but kind of like taking the rope fiber and taking it apart further. And they form this really fine, squishy mesh that supports soft organs like the liver or the spleen, kind of like a hairnet would go over your hair. They're not very strong. They're also not very stretchy, but they can sort of give some form to soft organs like that. And then the last thing in this video is just to talk about, okay, so what about the ground substance? What the heck is ground substance? Well, it's a super general term. What it really means is in a connective tissue, the stuff that is not cells and not protein fibers, that is ground substance. In some tissues, it will be almost solid. Like in bone, the ground substance is primarily made of crystallized calcium, but in other tissues, it actually is almost completely fluid. Like in blood, it's about 90% water. And then in some tissues, it's kind of in between a fluid and a solid. So what's really in there is water to greater and lesser degrees, usually some proteins and sometimes some sugars. The more solid the ground substance, the harder it is for pathogens to get through. So usually when you're talking about worrying about pathogens, you're not worrying about solid tissues, you're worrying about body fluids. Okay? All right, so we'll stop there on that one, and then we'll get into the specifics, types of connective tissues in the next video.